Traditional security cooperation for comprehensive peace building in East Asia. He'll speak for about 40 minutes, following which we'll have a question and answer session. A little bit of instruction both for the in-house audience and the online audience. For the in-house audience, during the question and answer session, when you want to ask a question, press the button on the microphone unit in front of you so that the red light is on. Speak into it, and when you're finished, press it again so the red light goes off. If you're online, look down at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a question and answer box. You type your question into that box and we'll see it. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Dr. Howe.
Thank you very much, Denny. And thank you to everyone at the East-West Center for making me feel so welcome and for helping my productivity. I'm going to be covering quite a lot of material, a lot of different theoretical arguments and structures of security in East Asia. I will try to stick to my time, but please forgive me if I go on a bit too long, and we'll see how much we can get through. I'm going to launch straight into sharing the screen. Okay. And there we go. Good. So my first challenge was, of course, to decide the geographical parameters of my research. And East Asia itself is something of a contested concept. But what I've done is to look at the densest patterns of interaction, both positive and negative, and which have been viewed as sharing a degree of value conformity or community identity. So broadly speaking, my research incorporates analysis of the challenges to and opportunities for the international management of relations between the Northeast Asian states, China, including Hong Kong and Taiwan, Japan, the two Koreas, members of ASEAN, as well as the United States as security guarantor. I also consider some other states to the extent that they have the potential to become actively engaged in non-traditional security cooperation and leadership in the region. So I also look at Canada and Australia in my research. A lot of these terms you may already be familiar with, but some that I'm introducing here would be things like regional MiniLateralism. I'll be introducing a concept of second-tier powers, which are more powerful than middle powers, but still not aspiring to great powerhood. I'll be talking about the humanitarian development peace nexus, and also a responsibility to disrupt, all of which I will hopefully get to in the course's presentation. So East Asia has been considered to be the most Westphalian region in the world. So that's why we have the concept of Eastphalia. That is to say, the region most wedded to traditional state-centric conceptualizations of security, threat, peace building, as well as to state-centric national economic development projects. So not only are states considered the main referent object of security, but also security threats are generally identified from the perspective of states. International governance in the region has focused on minimizing interstate conflict through emphasizing non-intervention. Domestic governance has focused on emphasizing national interest, national strength and power to provide security and economic growth. So some of the common themes in the policy making in the region are nationalism, econophoria, where we try to solve all of our governance problems through economic growth. Key elements of this region's security architecture are that it lacks a Western-style security international organization. Instead, the security architecture is the product of the San Francisco hub and spoke system of bilateral security alliances with the United States. As such, regional peace and security are more dependent upon great power leadership and cooperation than perhaps anywhere else. Yet such leadership and cooperation has hitherto been in rather short supply. So the region remains resistant to international concepts and norms revolving around universalism, solidarism, collective security. It's been argued resistant to human rights, or at least universal human rights conceptualizations, human development, and human security. So one of the things I want to do in this presentation and in my broader research is look at opportunities to promote these areas of cooperation. These normative and human-centered governance issues are further imperiled by an abdication of leadership from and competition between the great powers in the region. But these policy arenas, I would argue, also represent noble opportunities for second-tier actors to pursue niche diplomatic endeavors, which not only benefit the most vulnerable individuals and groups, but also raise the prestige and influence of the actors on the international stage. Furthermore, I would argue, and I hope, they represent areas of potential cooperation between second-tier actors and can serve as confidence-building measures, allowing reconciliation between formerly antagonistic entities like Japan and South Korea, and ultimately spill over into more traditional security issues. So the framework that I've been following in my research, and I still have quite a way to go, but I've been looking at the theoretical and practical shifts in the security and governance paradigms, as well as peace building. I've looked at multilateralism, and I'll talk a bit about multilateralism later, and the historic roles of middle powers, especially at the level of global multilateralism in non-traditional security areas. In regional terms, I'm going to look at regional minilateralism and the rise of second-tier powers in the region, primarily as strategic partners with the United States, but also why this is problematic. Then I'll talk a bit more about the noble opportunity of a more comprehensive approach to peace building. Finally, I will look at the regional non-traditional security cooperation, which I've termed a responsibility to disrupt. But with greater power comes greater responsibility for these second-tier actors to stand up and be counted. And this has been acknowledged by some of the second-tier actors, like explicitly by South Korea. So all of this will combine to give us some idea of the prospects for a comprehensive peace building. So starting with the traditional interpretation of East Asian security, the continued regional dominance of the neorealist, neoliberal duopoly in both theory and practice, despite the rise of competing theoretical perspectives, has been a function of the ongoing primacy of the state in both domestic and international governance in East Asia. Related to this has been the ongoing hegemony of great state powers, both global and regional, despite their abdication of constructive leadership and the systemic security threats posed by their competition. So realist perspectives focus on conflict management, just trying to reduce the worst effects of interstate competition, that of interstate war, trying to make sure that the balance of power in the international system reflects the balance of capabilities. So nothing beyond conflict management. The liberal focus has been on the virtuous triangle of democratic peace, economic interdependence, and international organization. But again, I would argue that this is very limited. At most, it reaches the level of conflict resolution, a very tenuous resolution that may not hold. So what we need to do is transform conflictual relationships in the region, both within states and between states. And I think we're only going to do that if we're taking a much more comprehensive approach to the problem. In the contemporary governance discourse, and increasingly in practice, peace and security are contested concepts in terms of the referent object, the scope of issues covered, so the degree of securitization, and indeed within specific issues. New thinking on security has come to the fore with input from academics and from practitioners in international organizations and indeed in middle powers. So non-traditional security perspectives and new security challenges have seen the broadening of the scope of inquiry along the x-axis of issues from a strict focus on national survival in a hostile operating environment to include some or all of the following: a focus on non-military rather than military threats, transnational rather than national threats, multilateral or collective rather than self-help security solutions. Within both the security and peace-building discourses, there's been an increasing emphasis on individual human beings and the planet or global biosphere, which corresponds to a bidirectional expansion along the y-axis of referent objects. So conflict transformation seeks to change the conditions that give rise to the underlying root causes of the conflict. And it draws attention to the systemic transforming of social relationships, potentially leading to a comprehensive and lasting peace. This represents a key departure from the universalist aspirations of the dominant liberal peace-building paradigm. So let's just have a quick recap of the liberal peace-building paradigm as is generally presented. You have all these accepted best governance practices upon which states are supposed to build their societies, but also upon which we're supposed to construct international society. This is very problematic. Lots of criticisms, especially from within the East Asian region. First of all, the liberal peace-building paradigm represents Western liberal values, and so therefore may not be directly transferable to the region, and indeed represents a degree of value imposition on actors, by external actors, on domestic actors. And as part of this, it ignores local actors, processes, and values. So this alien imposition is both illegitimate and potentially ineffective. Also, the liberal peace-building paradigm doesn't live up to its universal aspirations or pretensions. That it's very selective. We decide collectively, the collective West or international community representatives decide where we're going to intervene to promote a liberal peace. And usually that's in countries that are seen to be adversarial towards the Western states. Indeed, the liberal peace-building paradigm is hegemonic and hierarchical in terms of both actors and these issues that are promoted as being universal when in fact they are selective. It's also top-down. Top-down peace-building cannot transform conflictual relationships or build up resilient societies. And in particular, this liberal peace-building approach, because it's top-down, because it's state-centric, neglects human security and human development. Oh, I skipped over one, never mind. Comprehensive peace building addresses these shortcomings, and comprehensive peace building in particular addresses the intersections of all three of the pillars of the United Nations, not just security, but also bringing in development and human rights. Indeed, human security is core to comprehensive peace building and is found at the intersection of the three pillars of the United Nations. In particular, middle powers have been seen as championing at the global level these human security initiatives, but middle powers themselves are something of an essentially contested concept. What we can agree on is that middle powers lack the military resources to dominate or the economic resources to bribe others into policy changes. They differ from system ineffectual states, states that have no capacity to impact on the international system or the international security architecture. They are potentially system affecting states. They're also different from rising states, which is another category that we encounter in the literature. Rising states are those that potentially have the capacity or the inclination to aspire to great powerhood. Another characteristic, a common characteristic of middle powers, is middle powermanship. The sorts of policies they pursue, the sorts of policies they identify with, form a category of human-centered aspirational governance. As such, they are staunch multilateralists, far more so than the other categories. The great powers often look to pursue unilateral or at least bilateral diplomacy, whereas the weak powers often have no real impact. They suffer what they must. Somewhere in between, we have this category of power that collectively, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that they can have a degree of global influence above their station. And this is where we get to the role of multilateralism. What we've currently seen in terms of the promotion of the human-centered security agenda in international organizations. So international organization is a process, a transitional process from the international anarchic conditions which generate conflict towards the aspiration of global governance, whereby states are actively brought together to solve common problems, to reconcile their conflicting interests, to generate collective good, and to generate a more peaceful and secure international operating environment. International organizations are representative aspects of the phase that this process is reached at any given time. So international organization is primarily, although not exclusively, focused on the problem of interstate war. Meanwhile, global public governance is a much broader categorization and involves the formal and informal mechanisms through which high-minded or utopian ideals are translated into real-world international political action. Multilateralism is part of this broader concept. It can be defined as the practice of coordinating national policies in groups of 3 or more states through ad hoc arrangements or by the means of institutions. So here we can see how middle powers fit very nicely into this discourse. International commissions are probably the most prominent way in which middle powers have been very active on the global stage. International commissions are new forms of collective action. They're ad hoc, transnational investigative mechanisms, which can be constituted either as a temporary international organization or an NGO aimed at transforming the assumptions and staid thinking that plague long-standing problems in international relations. They featured prominently in consideration of both traditional security challenges and non-traditional security issues of global governance. And some of the most prominent examples are listed on the screen here. I was going to go into them in some detail, but I think that will, 1, bore everybody, and 2, that will use up far too much of my time, but we can discuss them in the Q&A session afterwards. Collectively, however, I think there are several important takeaways from these international commissions initiatives. First, they all attempt to employ a holistic approach to the challenges of international governance. They encompass traditional and non-traditional security agendas. They build broadly along the x-axis of issues, considering the interaction and intersection between these different issues. Secondly, they challenge the artificial legitimacy and centrality of the state. So they also build along the y-axis of referent object. Third, they reject the dominance of great powers, demonstrating the considerable initiating and agenda-setting potential of the middle powers, especially West Germany, Sweden, Norway, Australia, and Canada. So that's all good. But I have a number of problems with these examples of global governance initiatives. First, while these examples of multilateralism are all middle power led, the initiators are all Western middle powers with global aspirations for their niche diplomatic endeavors. So they could be criticized in the same way that the liberal peacebuilding agenda is criticized. As a result of which, middle powers have experienced severe challenges in operating on the global stage. And a lot of these international commissions have formed great talking shops, but their practical impact has been more limited. They often come up against the harsh realities of great power intransigence, but also regional epistemological resistance to their normative universalism. So much so that some commentators, previously champions of middle powers, have talked about whether these initiatives are in fact doomed to fail. I'm not sure they're doomed to fail, but I think that we need to refocus. We need to refocus in regional terms rather than global terms, regional aspirations and regional actors, such as are demanded by the peculiarities of the international management of relations in East Asia. And secondly, I think we need to refocus on a few key actors, an evaluation of powers that have greater than middling resources, and therefore greater capacity to affect change, especially when these resources are concentrated within a limited geographic area. So this is where we get to regional minilateralism and the rise of second-tier powers. Failures of multilateralism represent not only the perpetual lack of global international consensus, but also a flawed obsession with multilateralism as the panacea for all the world's ills. So critics have advised we abandon the fool's errand of multilateralism in favor of minilateralism, by which is meant a smarter, more targeted approach, bringing to the table the smallest possible number of countries needed to have the largest possible impact on solving particular problems. Usually, this smallest possible number is seen as 3 to 5 states. At the same time, there are advocates of regional multilateralism who promote it as the next paradigm that can bring about peace, cooperation, and stability in global affairs. What I try to do in my research is combine these two concepts, minilateralism, but also the regional flavor of multilateralism. So I'm going to evaluate the prospects for regional minilateralism in East Asia. We've certainly seen a proliferation of regional minilateral initiatives in the region. And we've seen a more prominent role for what I term second-tier powers. Current regional minilateralism is primarily concerned, however, with the analysis of the strategic operation of security institutions containing between 3 and 5 actors, but led by the United States. And I think that's also potentially problematic, but we'll get to that later. The standard bearer of regional minilateralism is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, comprising the US, Japan, Australia, and India, which was resuscitated in version 2.0 in 2017. The boldest minilateralism has been acclaimed as AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US minilateral security arrangement, which brings together already close allies to further deepen defense technology cooperation. Clearly, the key actor in this regional strategic minilateralism remains the United States. Japan, South Korea, and Australia also feature as important second-tier regional actors, however. India and the UK are important second-tier actors, but currently do not as yet play a significant role as external actors in regional minilateralism in East Asia. So far, what I've considered in my research is the second-tiermanship of Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Japan, of course, is formerly a great power. Since then, has lost that status and has been reduced to being considered as a reactive state, so essentially having no impact. This despite the fact that it has the 9th largest military budget in the world, some of the most advanced military technology, making it the 5th most powerful military after the great powers of the US, Russia, and China, and the rising power, so aspirational great power, India. So Japan is certainly more than a mere middle power in terms of resources. What's been lacking until recently was the political will to be more assertive and to provide regional leadership in the security field. This has been significantly addressed under what's being termed Japan's incremental security normalization. Meanwhile, South Korea has long been more than a middle-ranked power, despite self-identifying as a middle power. While in terms of territory, it's certainly on the small side, especially when compared with global powers, and its population base is indeed somewhere in the middle of the pack. Measurements of its military and economic might are far in excess of such a hierarchical position. 550,000 active servicemen and women places South Korea 8th globally. If its reserves are included, South Korea's total of 3,699,000 places it second only to that of Vietnam. South Korea's defense budget is in the top 10 of global expenditure, at more than $50 billion US. As a result of this, South Korea's military might ranks at number 6 in the world, just behind that of Japan. In addition, South Korea has emerged as the world's fastest growing arms exporter, with aspiration to be number 4 in the world. South Korea is also in the top 10 in terms of gross domestic product, just behind Canada, but ahead of Russia. Korea is in fact part of a very exclusive club of only 8 states with over 50 million population and over 30,000 GDP per capita. Seoul has been participating actively in regional multilateralism and is especially committed to ASEAN institution and community building efforts. Finally, Australia, although not possessing the military might of Japan and South Korea, has nevertheless consistently been considered one of the most important spokes of the San Francisco system, and is often the first name on the list of potential minilateral security initiatives. While formally being an external actor to the region, Australia has been incredibly active within it. Australia, in fact, is often characterized as America's sheriff or America's deputy in the region. Australian self-perception is of an ability to help shape world resources to urgent global challenges through active diplomacy, centered on the consequences for Australia of the emergence of the Asia-Pacific century. But as I already mentioned, I have real problems with the traditional security focus of East Asian minilateralism. First, these are largely Western constructs that attempt to fill the expectation and capability gaps in regular security systems. Given the understandable regional resistance to external strategic interference, which can even be viewed as a form of neo-imperialism, they face immediate obstacles to the peaceful management of conflictual relations in East Asia. Indeed, there are lingering concerns that minilateral partnerships are designed to serve large power interests and not the interests of states in the region. Secondly, those that are being championed by the US and which are most prominent in the security field are seen as being constructed primarily to contain the rising China rather than to resolve regional governance issues. This raises three related issues. First, the likelihood that China will push back against and attempt to undermine the operation of institutions that appear constructed to thwart their own strategic objectives. Second, competing iterations of minilateralism risk narrowing the space available for small and middle powers, and even second-tier powers to operate, as they're thrust into a with us or against us narrative. Third, forcing regional actors to choose will undermine the coherence of minilateral organizations themselves. And this leads to a third problematic area for regional security minilateralism, that of its exclusionary rather than inclusive nature. As I've already mentioned, regional actors in East Asia are resistant to multilateral security initiatives precisely because they do not trust others to look after their interests. So we need to build up from regional, non-traditional security cooperation. And we also need a more comprehensive approach to governance. And this is where we get to the humanitarian development peace nexus. In 2005, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan referenced the interrelatedness of the three pillars of the United Nations by noting, "We will not enjoy security without development, development without security, and neither without respect for human rights. Unless all these causes are advanced, none will succeed." In doing so, he neatly encapsulated both the progress made by the evolution of security and governance conceptualizations, as well as the ongoing challenges. Over time, as I previously mentioned, security provision in both theory and practice has become increasingly entwined with other governance aspirations and provisions. Policy prescription and obligation for those who govern, as well as peace builders, therefore, must increasingly consider spillover between these diverse agendas. And this has been reflected in the HDPN discourse. The Interagency Standing Committee, a UN Humanitarian Assistance Forum, has emphasized that peace is not only about the absence of violence, but also about sustaining peaceful societies. And that positive peace comprises the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. It implies creating social relationships that contribute to mutual well-being, creating an optimum environment in which human potential can flourish. So very much along the lines of both conflict transformation, but also comprehensive peace building. In response to these peace building complexities, in 2016, the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council adopted twin resolutions laying out a vision for sustaining peace and describing the peace agenda in the most comprehensive and encompassing way to date. These resolutions noted that sustaining peace should be broadly understood as both a goal and a process to build a common vision of a society, ensuring that the needs of all segments of the population are taken into account, which encompasses activities aimed at preventing the outbreak, escalation, continuation, and recurrence of conflict. So the HDPN is a holistic approach to providing for the safety and well-being of vulnerable individuals and groups. It is not, or at least it should not be, viewed as a sequential approach. We must pursue all of these agendas simultaneously. So instead of the three pillars of the UN, we have the three pillars of the HDPN and the intersections between them. Again, however, there are some shortcomings. Significant work has been carried out on the intersection between development and peace building. including economic interdependence, economically induced peace, as well as considerations of positive peace, distributive justice, human security, human development, and so on. Work has also been done on the intersection between humanitarianism and peace building, such as global governance initiatives on the R2P, the protection of civilians during armed conflicts, peacekeeping, the responsibility while protecting, security sector reform, and so on. Governance developments on the intersection between humanitarianism and development include rehabilitation, reconstruction, post-conflict recovery, disaster risk reduction. So there's a recognition of among both academics and policymakers of the close relationship between these concepts, and that they're unified around governance aspirations, providing for the well-being of human beings in both international and domestic operating environments. Overall, however, these initiatives have not gone far enough. They are still overwhelmingly siloed, pursued independently of one another. So you have maybe two of the pillars, but not all three pillars being pursued simultaneously. They're still top-down, donor or international actor-driven, reliant on aggregate measurements of government success. Humanitarian efforts have focused on the intersection of human rights and security, and this has led to politicization of the agenda because of competing conceptualizations of human rights. Development has focused on the intersection of human rights and development. Security is only given lip service within these actors' policy documents. Peace building has focused on the relationship between peace and development, and also on the relationship between humanitarianism and peace, but not on the relationship between humanitarian and development. And this also, of course, leads to further criticism of the liberal paradigm. So I think we have a noble opportunity for second-tier powers in the region. And indeed, if we look at the Indo-Pacific strategies of East Asian second-tier powers, we see some inclination towards embracing these objectives. Major second-tier powers that are looking at a more comprehensive approach to Indo-Pacific strategies include Japan, Korea, Australia, but also Canada. And this is where we get to what I've termed the responsibility to disrupt. In business theory, the term disruptive innovation was coined to describe an innovation that creates a new market and value network and eventually disrupts an existing market and value network. Here, it's proposed that we adopt the term in a much more positive way to apply to the radical, out-of-the-box thinking and practices needed to address both traditional security and non-traditional security challenges in East Asia. Operationalizing the HPDN needs holistic, comprehensive, human-centric approaches. It needs a little p as well as a big P focus, which means we need to look at the grassroots peace-building agenda as well as the interstate peace-building agenda. A little h as well as a big H approach to humanitarianism. We already have a tacit little d as well as a big D in the development discourse. So we see the possibility for both peace building and security spillover through these intersections. And that's why I'm proposing regional non-traditional security minilateralism. And this would include, but would not be limited to, regional as opposed to global international commissions. Such commissions could be launched on a variety of issues like regional pandemic response, transnational pollution, regional refugee flows, disaster risk reduction, as well as traditional security issues such as nuclear proliferation, governance failure, the South China Sea dispute, etc. There are a number of advantages to taking this type of institutional approach. First, it would empower new East Asian agents. Second, it would remove the great power tensions from non-traditional security promotion. Third, it would allow for spillover from non-traditional security problem solving to traditional security de-escalation and confidence building. Further work needs to be done on the Indo-Pacific strategies of regional second-tier powers. I'm still in the middle of going over these. Most of them have only just been released in the last couple of months. So it's a bit of a hot topic, and we'll wait to see how much they actually believe in their own policies. But that is as far as I've got today. So on that note, thank you very much for your very kind attention. I look forward to discussing this further in the Q&A session.
Thank you, Professor Howe. We transition now to Q&A session. The floor is open for questions. I don't see any from the online audience yet. Anyone in the room have a question? Yeah, push the button until the red light comes on.
Hi, I am Jem, a PhD student in the Prof Institute for Peace Studies at Notre Dame. So I'm very interested in the responsibility to disrupt, because I'm coming from it from a social movement perspective, where the edge of protest, whether violent or non-violent, is their ability to disrupt whatever the status quo is. So it's very intriguing that you're using it here. I felt in a different sense, but disruption also incites conflict, right? So how might it unsettle the triangle of peace building, humanitarianism, and development that you're also proposing, the HDPN pillar, for example, if you can speak more to that. Thank you.
I'm very interested in the absence of climate in your analysis, and just wondered if you could speak a little bit about it. It's becoming such a crisis now. How do you see this fitting into this very interesting rubric that you're developing?
Hi, Kevin Woods, a fellow in the research program here at East West Center. I think what I want to do is maybe link both of those questions. I feel like they're related. I really appreciated your decentering, or I guess pivoting away from Western conceptions of liberal peace building and bringing that back to the region and what that would mean in those conditions and contexts. So I really like that project of yours. But I was, at the same time, I'm therefore a bit surprised that people were not a part of your presentation. And so I'm wondering where, how that fits social movements, or to put it another way, at the last point of your slide was, well, what then does minilateralism in TS mean to you? And does that involve, for example, working on issues related to climate change, such as that is a big cornerstone of our work here at the center? What does environmental non-traditional security look like within your new framing that you're presenting to us today? Thank you.
Yes, I certainly do appreciate those questions, very challenging questions for me to respond to. Actually, I think within the larger body of the research, I have been addressing these issues, but maybe not in the presentation explicitly because time constraints. But starting with responsibility to disrupt and the radical unsettling of established norms, absolutely, I would link this to the increased activism of societies. For instance, when we're looking at resilience, disaster resilience, the first responders are always the communities themselves. And this is when we're looking at the small d response and the small h response. We have to look at societies and individuals and groups and activists. And in fact, whilst both are important, the big H and the small h, I think the small h is actually more important because of the first responders. We saw what happened with the absence of small h empowerment in Myanmar with Cyclone Nargis, when civil society was actually disenfranchised and was prosecuted for trying to raise awareness of the danger, that this dramatically increased the vulnerability of the country. Likewise, I've done some work comparing different natural disasters in the Philippines, and where social capital is higher, deaths are lower. There's quite a good correlation there. So certainly part of my radical unsettling is the attack on the state-centric nature of both traditional and non-traditional security and governance. So I'm very much in agreement with you, the importance of civil societies. In terms of climate, absolutely, I did touch on this when I talked about the expansion along the y-axis to the global biosphere, but also in terms of some of the challenges of only taking a large D approach is the environmental degradation. And where it fits in with my analysis is I think that rather that when we see all the challenges at the global level in dealing with climate crises, maybe there's more room for a regional initiative. A lot of the international commissions I listed up there were actually climate-related international commissions, and it's an area that middle powers have been very active, but they come up against this stumbling block of the great powers' resistance, but also competing regional understandings. But that doesn't mean that we can't do something at the regional level, especially if we're addressing things like desertification, the yellow dust in Northeast Asia, and the haze in Southeast Asia. These are related issues that I think there's probably a greater possibility for regional progress than there is for global progress potentially. And then if all the different regions are pursuing their own regional initiatives, the aggregate impact will be positive. And this leads to the third question, social movements and people, environment, and climate. Actually, I think that the gravest security challenges that we are facing are all non-state-centric. So pursuing the old state-centric approaches are not only ineffectual, they're potentially counterproductive. So if you look at, obviously, we're still in the grips of COVID, but also other pandemics. That's one crisis. The climate crisis is another crisis that cannot be addressed at the level of state security. The third grave crisis, I would argue, at a global level is the humanitarian crisis of refugees and forced migrants, which again cannot be addressed at a state level, a single state level, but also probably cannot be addressed at a global level. You need a regional approach to dealing with these issues because of regional epistemological traditions and security concerns. I hope I answered the questions.
I remind our online audience, you can ask questions by typing them into the Q&A box function at the bottom of your screen. Don't have any questions yet from the online audience. I'm wondering if you guys are paying attention. I'll go back to the room. Any other questions? Ben.
Thanks, Brendan. So we were chatting beforehand, and before you started, we were saying this was going to be a courageous presentation because it's sort of swimming against the conventional wisdom. So allow me to just give one or two critiques based on the courageous presentation. It seems to me that you're really arguing for more institutions, minilateral institutions, which I think begs the question of this, is that really what we need right now? More institutions. We have a lot of institutions that don't function terribly well at the international level. But I think the more serious problem is, and it's inherent in what you laid out at the beginning, that East Asia is a region as you said, it's very Westphalian. It's extremely resistant to interference, criticism from other countries. I mean, no country likes being criticised, but these days hate it. And don't even get me started when it's a cross-cultural critique, like it from, say, Australia, for example. You know, hate it. Lots more. Japan hates hearing from Korea. Korea hates hearing from Japan. Your proposal sort of skates over that and suggests that somehow these very issues that are mostly dealing with sort of internal, humanitarian issues are mostly, they're going to be dealt with at some level within a state, can be addressed successfully in a region that has this defining characteristic. And I guess I'm just puzzled. How is this actually going to happen, given where we are, where we're starting?
So yeah, thanks. I had sorry. So I actually had some very similar thoughts. So my impression was that you're talking about regionalization, but maybe you're actually talking about localization in the sense that you want countries in the region to kind of take the initiative. Which I do agree to a certain extent. Does make a lot of sense, but to Ben's point, I do think there are those obstacles where you began the presentation by talking about we can't even agree on what East Asia means, right? And so if we lack those consensuses, then how do we build on those? And then the other point, I think, I do think America's role is kind of interesting here because yes, it can be an impediment in a lot of ways if you think about China, but also I think there's a lot of countries, US, Japan, South Korea, Japan, and even Australia that want the US in there as well. So it's not as if maybe if it's only focused on non-traditional security, then maybe it might be better that way. But can the countries in the region make that distinction? Or do they want to make that distinction?
Thank you very much for those comments. I think I have something of a response. I'm not sure if it's a convincing response. But first of all, more minilateral institutions, is that really what we need? I think we need a different type of minilateral institution. That the current minilateral institutions are focused just on traditional security in partnership with the United States. So really you're just expanding a bilateral relationship between the US and its deputy to the US and its posse. And I think that's inherently problematic and probably doomed to fail, although maybe not doomed to fail in its own terms, if it's just looking at it as a military alliance rather than a minilateral institution, which I think is the danger with the current minilateral institutions. If we have minilateral non-traditional security institutions, of which we don't at the moment, let me be frank, there are no such things, which is why I'm proposing them. The role of the United States actually does become more problematic because part of the appeal of non-traditional security minilateralism is that it's more acceptable to Westphalian or Eastphalian actors because it's less confrontational. And in fact, we already do have some inclination towards cooperation between these hostile parties at the non-traditional security area. Even China, Japan, and South Korea do collaborate on desertification, or at least they're talking about collaboration. We'll see if they actually do get around to it. But because they're all affected by yellow dust. So it's the fact that everyone is being affected by these non-traditional security challenges, but also that these challenges are not coming from your enemies, that it makes it easier to combine together against the challenge, if you like, rather than against the other. We also see this in peace building. and peacekeeping operations. The Japanese and Koreans have even shared ammunition in peacekeeping operations, although that was very controversial. So I just get the feeling that there's a greater willingness to cooperate in areas that are seen as less vital to national survival in a hostile operating environment. In terms of regionalization or localization, yeah, I guess it's a bit of both. What I'm looking at doing is empowering local actors and voices to deal with local problems or global problems at the local level. And again, yes, this may well mean that we don't need the United States, or the United States may even be problematic in terms of engagement in these areas. But I think that the prioritization of US membership in regional organizations in East Asia has mainly been in terms of security organizations or trade organizations because of the pull of the American market. But also, of course, Japan has been a major proponent of US engagement in order to lessen the hostility against the normalization of Japan's foreign policy. If we have America there as well, you're less likely to see Japan dominate. But I think this is actually reduced in recent years. One, because other powers are also growing in strength, and Japan is at most first among equals among South Korea and Australia as well, potentially. But secondly, because Japan has gone to great lengths to lessen hostility towards its increased activism. So I think that, okay, we both live in Korea. There's still a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment. But that's a bit of an outlier now. If you look at the rest of the region, there's a lot less hostility towards Japanese leadership than was the case in the 1970s when we had anti-Japanese riots in Southeast Asia.
We're very close to our finishing time. Is there a final question? Still nothing from the online audience? Yes.
In your discussion of the regional middle powers, can you talk about how Taiwan fits into that conversation? And then ultimately, how does it fit into a minilateral construct? I mean, I think interestingly enough, right, there's been a change from its neighbors, right, how they talk about Taiwan, specifically Japan, right, this recent announcement of possible Japan, Philippines, like US, you know, again, not in the minilateral, obviously, concept, but can you just expound a little bit about that, and how is that role balanced, knowing there is an inherent conflict there based on the PRC? Thank you.
Yes, certainly. Actually, again, in my wider research notes, which is about 15,000 words at the moment, and still growing. So I don't know what, it's going to have to be a book. I do talk about Taiwan, and certainly Taiwan has the potential to be a middle power, but is faced with these geopolitical constraints. But this is very much in the traditional security realm. If you get out of the traditional security realm, you're right, the neighbors are increasingly engaging Taiwan in non-traditional security initiatives. This really came to a head during the pandemic, when Taiwan was seen as having a very good response and a lot to offer, but was being blocked by China from actually offering anything. And a lot of regional communities, societies, as well as states, reacted much more positively towards Taiwan and the idea that Taiwan should be included more. I think potentially it's also less problematic to have Taiwan as part of a regional minilateral dealing with pandemics than it is from the Chinese perspective. And if it turned the Quad into the Quin, then I think the Chinese would really lose the plot. So I think that actually this, if anything, reinforces my argument for non-traditional security minilateralism in East Asia.
Let's thank Professor Howe for the work he did during the question and answer session. We'll be having another East-West Center Insights next month, so watch for it.